My name is Ranger Shannon. I'm here at Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine. And I'm very glad to welcome today a friend of mine, a colleague from the National Park Service, Steve Phan, who works at the Civil War Defenses of Washington. This is the first in what we hope will be a fun, interesting series on the Civil War in Baltimore in 1861. This is obviously the 160th anniversary of a critical period in the history of the Civil War. And so we've lined up a good group of speakers from throughout the state of Maryland to give us some different perspectives. Steve today is going to talk about how vital Washington was to the war effort. And he's very knowledgeable and very animated, and I know that you're going to enjoy his presentation. And I do want to thank the Friends of Fort McHenry for supporting this. They've made it possible for us to have a Zoom platform, so thank you very much to the Friends. And of course, thank you for Civil War Defenses of Washington for letting us bring Steve to you today. So Steve, if you're there, I'm going to turn it over to you if you'd like to share your screen.
All right, cool. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Phan. I'm a park ranger at the Civil War Defenses of Washington. I'm currently serving as the Chief of Inter at Camp Nelson National Monument in Kentucky. I see some familiar faces and names on here, so I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to first thank my friend, Ranger Shannon, for the invite to be a part of this program. She's one of the most inspired park rangers in the National Park Service that I know, so I'm grateful to be here to assist her and talk about Civil War Washington during this time period. As you mentioned, you kind of stole my thunder a bit here. 160th anniversary of the start of the Civil War in 1861, which is absolutely incredible. And so here we are. And I've been kind of thinking about how to create this program, and I've spent a lot of time researching on Lincoln's first inauguration and the preparations that were made by the Army and the federal government to really have this safe and peaceful transfer of power from the outgoing administration of James Buchanan to Abraham Lincoln. And then, I think we kind of jump into the war. And so as many that I see on the video now are Civil War historians or Civil War enthusiasts, there's generally a timeline of the Civil War in 1861. We start with Lincoln's inauguration in March. We have Fort Sumter, the crisis there, and then we have war. And then we think about the first battle of Manassas or Bull Run, and then we have the major escalation of the conflict going into the end of 1861 and into 1862. But I really appreciated how Shannon's like, hey, let's focus on April of 1861, obviously with what happens in Baltimore and what happens in Washington as well. Obviously, everything is interconnected here. So where am I going to start with this? I'm going to start with the origins. Really going back to the election of 1860, of course, but I found this from the Alexandria Gazette and Virginia Advertiser newspaper going back to January 15th of 1861. And this is, think about how early this timeline is, right? And we're General Winfield Scott, the commander-in-chief, the general-in-chief of the U.S. Army, had spent a lot of time in New York City, but he was called back to Washington by James Buchanan in December of 1860 to really oversee this, the security of the city, and then obviously this safe transfer of power from Buchanan to Lincoln. So that's going to be his role to do that. And he'll assign Charles Stone as the Inspector General of the District of Columbia to really oversee direct operations in regards to reorganizing the militia groups that are based in Washington, many who have hostile allegiances against the federal government, and many will join the Confederacy in the coming months, and really protect the Capitol during the course of the inauguration on March 3rd, 1863. But look at this quote, right? General Winfield Scott is still engaged in making preparations to guard against the possible breach of peace in Washington consequent on the present political agitation. Effective military forces are to be posted in several parts of the city. It is not probable that any but regular troops and the militia of the district will be employed for this purpose. They were actually very accurate about this. There were some elements of the regular army here, especially the regular army cavalry, vedettes that will be roaming the streets during the course of the inauguration. There's going to be their regular artillery. I mean, literally cannon pieces lined up on the streets, especially at the bridges and approaches to the Capitol. And there's going to be elements of the District of Columbia militia under the command of Charles Stone, who will be, kind of the physical presence on the ground. There are troops all over the city. There are even soldiers wearing civilian, I found an account of this, wearing civilian clothing, armed with pistols that are walking the crowd of the inauguration, just in case anything happened. And even there's Winfield Scott on the street to ensure that everything is going okay. And when Lincoln is inaugurated peacefully on March 3rd, he makes this very famous statement. He said, "Thank God." And, from that standpoint, I'm like, oh, so everything's good here in Washington. But, Lincoln steps into a smoldering crisis with what's happening in Florida with Fort Pickens. I think people forget about Fort Pickens quite often. I know my friend John Weaver does not forget about Fort Pickens. And obviously with Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor, what is there to do next, right? Are we really headed towards war? Are we gonna let these new Southern Confederacy, which formed in February, the Confederate States of America, really just seize federal property in the form of fortifications and army supplies and things like that? Lincoln had to figure that out. And so, as I said, origins really start back with, in regards to Washington, with the election of 1860, I talked about all the preparations being made, and then a very famous image of the Capitol on March 3rd, 1861, when Lincoln is inaugurated. And of course, we have to talk about the inauguration, the famous first inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln. And I had to kind of focus on this section here as we talk about what happens with Washington in the coming days, and obviously what happens across the country as well. I'm actually going to turn my camera off. I think, there we go. That's better because my internet is a little up and down here. But in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow country, and not mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. And not mine, meaning the federal government. So if war does break out, this is not the federal government's fault. The government will not assail you. You cannot have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. So, this is obviously instrumental to what's going to happen in the coming days, because it's when Lincoln gets the first day in office, he gets handed some telegrams from the federal garrison at Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor under Major Robert Anderson, saying, hey, we're going to run out of supplies. So you have to figure out, are you going to resupply us or not? And so that will be the question in the coming days. And he's hearing both basically support to reinforce Fort Sumter, and then people saying, no, don't force the issue, especially from the border states that are really looking keenly at what Lincoln's going to do in the coming days here, okay? So we got Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor. What's going to happen here? There's Confederate shore batteries aimed at the fort. They are not allowing supply boats to come to the fort without taking fire. And so Lincoln, hey, just let it go. Give away these forts to prove to the rest of the South, including especially the border states, that, hey, we do not want to start war here. There's other people, including people in his cabinet, are saying, we need to take a much firmer stance here and show that, hey, we will enforce federal rule and sovereignty here. And this is going to lead to, as we know, conflict in Fort Pickens in Florida, which is really resolved by April of 1861 down in Florida. But yeah, there's more threat against federal installations in the South as well. As I say, people really forget about Fort Pickens, which is also a part of the National Park Service at Gulf Island National Seashore. But these are the things that Lincoln's having to determine with his first few days as a commander-in-chief of the Union armies or the U.S. armies and navies, okay? And so we've got that, and then we got Washington itself. So I talked about the defense of the Capitol during the inauguration. That's going to be the main priority for Lincoln and the Army about 2 weeks into April as we have Fort Sumter. And for a lot of the Civil War enthusiasts here, I'm going to mention some names here. So one of the commanders that commanded a regular Army artillery battery at the inauguration was Prince John Magruder, of all people. Okay, U.S. Army officer who will resign and become a Confederate general in the coming days. So just think about all the mass resignations that will happen, that's happening before Fort Sumter, that will accelerate after Fort Sumter. So, I mean, there's a lot of tension within not only the government itself, but also the U.S. military. Okay, of course, we'll have the commencement of the war on reported the next day on April 13th, 1861 from the National Republican newspaper in DC by telegram, commencement of the war, attack on Fort Sumter by General Beauregard, PGT Beauregard. And so what you're going to see throughout this program is Lincoln's response, and the response to Lincoln's response, which will intimately affect what's going on in Washington. So we got the bombardment of Fort Sumter, which will fall on the 13th to Confederate forces in Charleston, South Carolina. And so this comes down to what happens next. And Abraham Lincoln has actually kind of been anticipating this, waiting for this moment for really the rebellious states, or this new idea of this government, the Confederate government, as we would say, this rebellious government, to make the first move, to basically strike the first blow, and will react. And obviously with Fort Sumter, we have war. And how is Lincoln going to respond? Well, I think a lot of people know about this. He calls for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. And he calls it from every state in the Union, which is important to understand. Oops, sorry about that. And I'm going to read that really quick, just a section of it. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, in virtue of the power in me vested by the Constitution and the laws, have felt fit to call forth, and hereby do call forth, the militia of several states of the Union to the aggregate number of 75,000 in order to suppress said combinations and to cause the laws to be duly executed. So Lincoln calls for volunteers. And you're going to see, these posters going up across the country. Each state will be called for a certain number of regiments, up to 1,000 men. Some offer tens of thousands, others offer just a few companies, okay? But what I love about this poster here, it says, an attack upon Washington anticipated. And that was my big focus of this program, is the open threat to Washington at this point. There's one fortification in Washington, Fort Washington, on the Maryland side of the Potomac River, much too far south of the capital to do much in protecting it. And you're going to see how surrounded Washington is as I move forward in this program. So we need volunteers. And so one of the things I really enjoyed about researching this project is the response from the state governors and the state authorities across the United States. And you're going to see here, they kind of run the gamut from one extreme to the next, actually. And you can see Governor Randall of Wisconsin. Let the president call for 100,000 more men, actually. We have no parties now. The people will not be content to furnish one regiment alone. And it's important to understand that these volunteers are only supposed to be called up for 90 days, which that's the only authority the president has to call. So, we're seeing this as obviously an escalation of hostilities, open hostilities, warfare, but hopefully something that Lincoln hopes that can be suppressed within a couple months. That's the ultimate goal here, of course. And he's going to rely on Winfield Scott to coordinate the defense of the Capitol, which is really important. The goal of really bringing all these volunteer troops to Washington will fall to the War Department under the oversight of the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron. And so almost all these dispatches are written in response to Lincoln's proclamation or call, but they're directed to the War Department, to the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron. Okay, and so you've got Mr. Randall calling, we'll send you 100,000 men. Governor Morton of Indiana says, on behalf of the state of Indiana, I tender you for the defense of the nation and the uphold of the authority of the government, 10,000 men. So I just wanted to give you a couple examples of how these northern states are responding to Lincoln's call for troops, and then I'll give you the southern states' response as well. And so we have Washington City itself, really cool map from 1851 there. But we have the federal capital itself, and one thing I'm going to illustrate moving forward here is Washington, D.C. is in a bowl. South, obviously, is the Potomac River and Virginia. To the north is Maryland. So Washington, D.C., by character, by kind of upbringing, by tradition, is a southern city. I mean, it's the federal city, of course, but in sentiment, there's many people that live in Washington, obviously around Washington, that will support the rebellion. And that will be a major cause of tension for the War Department and the government as well. And here's a map of the defenses of Washington, actually during the Civil War. And I don't want you to focus on that. I want you to focus on Washington in the middle of the screen there. You can see the colors of the Washington city itself. But what's to the south? You've got Virginia. And to the north and east, you've got Maryland. And this is all high ground here. And so the government, or the seat of the government, including the Capitol building, the White House, they're all under threat of enemy attack. And I'll talk about what that looks like moving forward, but I want to give you an idea of the topography of DC to understand the crisis that's happening in the Capitol. So this is a government clerk. He talks about how treason is in our midst. And you see the date there. We're about to have the bombardment start at Fort Sumter later that evening. But you can't really trust anyone, according to people that live in Washington. As I said, there's going to be mass resignations from guys that are in the U.S. military, and there's calls from state representatives and or representatives from states and senators that are calling for the breakup of the Union here. So what's going to happen? Lincoln and his cabinet are trying to figure this out, and so the Capitol is under threat. So the first defenders we talked about, there are some regular Army units here, but not that many. There are some militia groups around, but not that many. I think Charles Stone, accordingly, has done a very good job of reorganizing the militia groups in D.C. Especially, he got rid of the disloyal factions, and they did a really good job of being a military presence in Washington during the inauguration. But they're going to be around as well. James Lane and his group of Kentuckians. Literally, there's about a company of men. They're each armed with about a dozen rounds, and they're posted on the lawn of the White House. Okay, so this is the immediate defense of the Capitol will be armed military personnel and also civilians as well. This is how dire this is. And then in the coming days, and you're going to see me detail this, are troops, regular Army troops, which Winfield Scott is really calling for, but militia groups from all over the country, mostly of the north, are headed towards Washington, and there's going to be a lot of tension, and there's going to be open conflict as well. Okay, so let's talk about some of the groups that were sent to Washington, and look at the date here, April 19th, 1861, sent from Albany, New York, the capital of New York. And this is from Governor Edwin Morgan. And as I said, they really need men to go and defend the Capitol. They need men with weapons, okay? And so one of the first groups that will be sent within a week of Fort Sumter is the 7th Regiment, 7th New York State Militia, one of the most renowned organizations within the country, one of the best drilled militia groups in the country. And you can see they're going to be sent immediately. What about the other volunteer regiments? Well, they're going to be sent in due time as well. And where do these men end up? Well, they actually first arrive and are quartered at the U.S. Capitol building. They spend time in the U.S. Capitol, and they're there for a few days. And the last week or so of April of 1861, before they are sent north to what we now know as Meridian Hill Park, which is managed by the National Park Service at Rock Creek Park. They established a camp there called Camp Cameron, named after the Secretary of War. And so this is one of the force units that arrives, is the 7th New York State Militia. You can see they're wearing these very distinct militia uniforms. And I always found these images really particularly fascinating. Is you see these images of these young African-American, I mean, that's a boy, a very young man. What's his status? Washington, D.C. is still allows slavery. That does not change until 1862. So, where exactly did this gentleman come from? Did he join the men as they made their way down to D.C.? I'm not sure we'll ever know, but it's something worth investigating. And here's another image of these guys in camp. They're a 90-day group, by the way, and then they'll be recalled back to New York, basically towards the beginning of summer here. Another image, and you can see another African American, likely a camp servant or an officer servant as well. But as early as 1861, I mean, we're talking April 61. There's direct interaction between soldiers and African Americans, and that will really escalate and really inspire the evolution of the war, restoration of the Union to really this wider conflict as we move forward into 62 and 63. And perhaps the most famous gentleman that was a part of the 7th New York State Militia is this gentleman right here, the dashing young lieutenant. Well, he's not a lieutenant yet, but he is Robert Gould Shaw of the 54th Massachusetts fame. He is with this regiment, and this is what he writes on April 27th, 1861, about a week after they arrived. Yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock, we had a grand parade, and we're all sworn into the service of the United States government. It was a very impressive scene as we all held up our hands and repeated the oath together after the mattresses. We are Uncle Sam's men now for the next 30 days. Old Abe stood out in front of us, looking as pleasant and kind as possible, and when we presented arms, took off his hat in the most awkward way, putting it on again with his hand on the back part of the rim, country fashion. And this is one of my, I find this such an insightful recording from Shaw of the president. I couldn't help thinking of the immense responsibility he has on his shoulders as he stood there laughing and talking. And then he ends it with this, which will provide some humor. I have seen many uglier men, period. So we've got Mr. Shaw there, who is just a regular member of the militia. And then in the coming days, he'll get a commission as a lieutenant with the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry. And as we know, he will later become the famed colonel of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry that served in the Civil War. So that's just one of the units that will be sent to Washington to really reinforce the beleaguered forces that are there. But what about the response from the other states in the Union? Well, what about Kentucky, where I'm at currently? Well, from the capital of Frankfort, Beriah McGoffin, the governor, he sent this response a day after, or the same day the president issued his order, actually a day after, he issued it on April 14th. Your dispatch is received. In answer, I say emphatically, Kentucky will furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister southern states in caps, which made me think, well, what happens next? Well, interestingly enough, you'd imagine that they would offer troops to the Confederate forces that were forming at this time, but actually not. He played the middle ground here. And in the coming days, there would be the Assistant Secretary of War for the Confederate government will request troops from Kentucky, and Governor McGoffin actually says no. And by May of 1861, the state will declare a neutrality policy, and they become one of the border states. one of the states that maintains slavery but remains in the Union. It's a very tenuous relationship with the federal government, and we'll certainly see that where I'm at Camp Nelson moving forward. But that just gives you an idea of one of the border states, okay, that stays in the Union. What about Tennessee? Well, a few days later from Nashville, Governor Isham G. Harris writes this pretty direct response. Your dispatch to the 15th instant informing me that Tennessee is called upon for 2 regiments of militia for immediate service is received. Tennessee will not furnish a single man for purpose of coercion, but 50,000 if necessary for the defense of our rights and those of our Southern brethren. I mean, that's a very, I don't think that's going to happen. And as we know, one of the most dramatic outcomes of Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops is these states that are kind of figuring out where they want to align will jump over to the Confederacy and leave the Union. And obviously one of them will be Tennessee, one of the last states to leave the Union. And he's very serious about this. Interestingly enough, Nashville will be the first Confederate state capital to fall to Union hands in February of 1862. And perhaps most importantly, well, especially with what will happen in Washington is what happens with Virginia. And I think this is the most important aspect of the defense of the Capitol in the coming days, weeks, months, and years in Washington, D.C. And you can see this here. You can see the date on the bottom, April 18th. This will push Virginia over to secession. And we talked about where, especially Northern Virginia was located in correlation or in connection with Washington. This will be a major issue here. There will be the almost immediate seizure of Harpers Ferry Arsenal by rebel forces, taking about 15,000 arms and even munitions to create more weapons. This is happening literally within a week. Fort Sumter and in response to Lincoln's call for more reinforcements. Okay, so I would like to read to you Virginia's response to this, which was written on April 16th. And he says, in no such way will the state of Virginia support Lincoln's call to supply militia troops for this. And he says, you have chosen to inaugurate civil war, and having done so, we will meet in it a spirit as determined as the administration has exhibited towards the South. So Virginia's gone, and that will directly affect, as I said, the defense of the Capitol moving forward. Okay, so I call this Mr. Lincoln's War. And so what's going to happen, well, in the coming days here? Well, as I said, he's going to rely on Winfield Scott, who's still the general-in-chief, the brevet lieutenant general, to kind of dictate war policy here. I think a lot of people have heard of, Scott's Great Snake, his Anaconda plan to seize the Confederate ports or the southern ports of the United States to really, start beginning this long and process stranglehold of the Confederate, really obviously supply bases and things like that. This starts in April. In the days after Fort Sumter, Lincoln will issue an order calling for the siege and the blockade of all the southern ports around the United States. He issues that, I believe, on April 19th, 1861. So as you can see, this war really is starting to escalate. I think Lincoln and his administration are trying to prevent really the spread of this, but by this point, it's pretty much over. Tennessee's going to join the Union, North Carolina and Virginia will as well, to form, the last 3 states of the Confederacy, and then we're going to have a combat really in the coming days. Okay, so how would I really think about concluding with this? Well, we talked about, actually, I would like to mention another thing here. Mr. Lincoln's War. Okay, so we talked about the 7th New York State Militia arriving in Washington. I forgot to create a slide for this, but there are other troops arriving as well, and pretty early, okay? The first major troops to arrive to Washington will be on April 15th, 1861. It'll be elements of the 2nd U.S. CAV, these of the regular army. They will later be redesignated as the 5th U.S. CAV moving forward in the war. But these are regular troops that will be called from their frontier service in the Department of Texas. And they're going to endure a long journey on really from the Texas coast to Key West, to Havana, to New York City, to Washington, D.C. So you can see that the War Department had been planning for this for months now, okay? So companies D and H will arrive to New York City and in late 18th, will be arriving on April 15th, just in time for Lincoln's call for more troops, okay? So including a part of that group is Major George H. Thomas, the future Rocket Chickamauga. He'll be bringing troops from Carlisle Barracks as well, okay? So we have the regular army, but most importantly, I mean, which is the most important, they're limited in number. You're gonna have a lot of the initial volunteer troops that had answered Lincoln's call, including this famous group called the First Defenders, who were very proud of this notion of being the first troops to arrive in Washington after the regular army. They arrived on the evening of April 18th, and there were 5 companies of troops from Pennsylvania, from Reading, Lewistown, 2 companies from Pottsville, and 1 from Allentown as well. They were 90-day militiamen, like the majority of the militia units that will be arriving. Like the 7th, they were quartered at the U.S. Capitol building. And one of the companies, Company D, will be sent to Fort Washington to garrison the fort from April through June of 1861. As I said, these companies were known as the First Defenders, okay? So actually one of the issues with the call for troops here is there's really no infrastructure or no really foundation to supply these men from the states, and then as they're being sent to Washington. So you're going to hear the state governors say this. They're like, hey, we can send you a couple regiments, a few thousand men, but they literally have no weapons. They have no uniforms. Will the government be supplying these men or furbishing these men with this? And in many cases, they would. Okay, so we're going to move forward towards the conclusion of this program. And you see the date there, March 24th, 1861. And this gets back to Virginia, of course. You know, in the final days of April, you're going to see some of the most important resignations from the U.S. Army, including Robert E. Lee and other high-ranking officers from Virginia that would join the Confederate Army and become general officers and will be fighting through the course of the Civil War here. But, you know, one of the important factors about Robert E. Lee is his property or his wife's property on the Arlington High Ground, or the Arlington Heights, the Arlington House. We call it the Lee Mansion as well in the Park Service. And what does that mean? Well, prior to Virginia's approval of or adoption of secession, the U.S. Army will be conducting a lot of reconnaissance around Washington, in Virginia, and Maryland as well, to basically reconnoiter the ground around Washington, determine the weak spots. Including in this group of Army officers is John Barnard, this engineer, a major at that time, and he advises his commander, who's General Joseph K. Mansfield, to seize the initiative. That the U.S. Army, per se, needs to cross the Potomac River, occupy the high ground, and ensure that enemy artillery cannot be rolled up to shell the federal capital, okay? And so that will be the main impetus. And when secession is officially adopted by the state of Virginia on May 23rd, 1861, that evening, the U.S. Army will cross the Potomac River and occupy Arlington. So you're going to see this map again, and I love it. It's a fairly early war image map of Washington, D.C. and the defenses of Washington. If you see those red dots there, those are the initial forts around Washington, which will be built, most of them will be built after the First Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, but that evening, they'll cross Long Bridge and Chain Bridge. About 18,000 men or so will occupy Arlington, including the Lee Mansion. And as you can see from that quotation, the very next day, the Army will start building fortifications on the heights of the Virginia shore. In many ways, this is the founding of the defenses of Washington. They built about a half dozen fortifications on the Virginia side in the coming weeks and months, leading to the Battle of First Manassas or Bull Run in July of 1861, okay? So first will be Arlington, and they'll also send by river transport troops all the way down to Alexandria, Virginia. So these very important strategic area and high ground communication center and supply center will be occupied by the federal forces in late May of 1861, and it will remain in federal hands for the remainder of the Civil War, which is critically important to understand for the defense of the Capitol and the building of the defenses of Washington. Okay, so here's a really cool sketch, early war sketch of, I believe, New Jersey militiamen building a fort in Virginia. You can see them wearing their havelocks there. So likely May, early June of 1861. One of the forts they built is Fort Runyan, actually the largest fort built in the defenses of Washington. It's actually built on the present day location of the Pentagon, an absolutely massive fort built on the northern Virginia side, of course, of Long Bridge, which was the key crossing point across the Potomac River from Virginia into Washington. And yeah, over the coming days, there's a great image of Fort Gaines near the Maryland border as well. You're going to have these troops erecting the defenses of Washington. Okay, so as I said, about a half dozen or so will be constructed in the weeks following the federal occupation of Virginia. And then obviously after the Battle of First Manassas Bull Run, you're going to have an elaborate system built around the city. By the end of the first year, you're going to have about 48 forts encircling the Capitol. And as we've discussed with the defenses of Washington, these forts will evolve over the course of the Civil War from 48 to 68 to mount 800 artillery pieces, 30 miles of military road, 35 miles of earthworks, one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world. But I think one of the really important legacies of April 1861 is the protection of the Capitol, which only enhances and evolves during the course of the Civil War. So we have obviously starting with, militia troops, some remnants of the regular army, and by May, heck, you've got fortifications. And by, July, August, September, you have a complete system of fortifications around the Capitol, which will only grow in size and scope and firepower during the course of the Civil War. And this is all happening over the span of 1 month, April of 1861. And as I said, over time, you're going to have these elaborate fortifications, the defenses of Washington, which I believe this is probably one of the most detailed images of the defenses of Washington at Fort Sumter near American University here today. But you're going to see these massive earthworks constructed around Washington. And I guess, one thing I forgot to mention, but I do have in my notes here, and I'm going to go back to this because I see that we have some time. I talked about Virginia. Well, heck, we have to talk about Maryland as well, which is right here on the map. See Montgomery County right there, Prince George County right here. Well, heck, there's the 7th Street Road that will take you right into Washington from Maryland. What happens with Maryland during this period? Well, and this will be touched upon. I'm sure Ranger Shannon will, touch upon this moving forward. The tension in Maryland. Will become a border state as well, a very tenuous relationship with the federal government as Kentucky. But one of the things that the northern states are trying to do is send men from Pennsylvania and New York through Maryland. And so I know that there's a future program during this special event that will talk about the chaos in Baltimore that's happening at the time. The riots that took place in Baltimore as troops are being sent to Washington. And so one of the issues that the Lincoln administration and the War Department have is they're losing communications because, these people that are, rebellious or willing to support the Confederacy are purposely destroying rail lines and telegraph lines as well. So it's kind of it's a dark spot in many ways to figure out what's going in, what's happening in Maryland at that time. We know about the 6th Massachusetts, which I know will be mentioned, and they're really contested arrival to Baltimore. And this will happen throughout the last couple weeks of April. And I wanted to share this with you. Okay. And this is from the Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas in Washington, and it was dated on April 19th. Okay. And this is in response to Governor Hicks's kind of on the fence response about, hey, we may allow troops to go through through Maryland, but we may not. We're still trying to determine that. The War Department was not having that. Okay. And this is what he writes. Governor Hicks has neither right nor authority to stop troops coming to Washington. Send them on prepared to fight their way through if necessary. By the order of the Secretary of War, Lorenzo Thomas, Adjutant General. So, I mean, that gives you an insight of, hey, if we need to get these men through, have them fix bayonets, they will make it to the Capitol to protect the government. Really, the seat of the government is under direct threat, and we will make this happen. Okay, so wanted to give you an idea of kind of what's going on in Maryland, kind of a glimpse, because this obviously is directly connected to the Capitol. And as I said, in the coming days with these other programs, they'll talk about, the riot with the 6th Massachusetts that was happening, the violence that occurred and how many men died, the occupation of Baltimore by federal troops as well will all be coming. But I wanted to give everyone kind of an insight about what was going on in Washington. As I said, by the end of April, the Capitol is relatively secure internally in regards to the troops in the city, but the immediate threat will be where that yellow star is at, Virginia, and that will be solved on March 23rd when federal troops cross the river. And as I said, we have the beginning of the defenses of Washington. And this is not the last time where Maryland will affect what happens in Washington. I have talked a lot about why the defenses of Washington evolve over the course of the war. It's because of what happens on the battlefield. And then and I can speak about that another time, but the Confederate invasion of Maryland in September of '62 drastically alters what happens in DC because the Confederate Army can come right down from Maryland and attack the city from the north. So all these forts along the northern defenses here will be expanded, including this one right in the middle of the 7th Street Road. We now know it as Fort Stevens, which will play a role in the battle 2 years later in 1864. So with that, I conclude my program. And if you want to hear more about us, of course, we co-hosted this program. So we have our Facebook page. We also have an Instagram page and our website as well. So thank you so much for having me, Ranger Shannon, and I'm here to answer questions or hear comments or anything you'd like to do moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. If folks have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can pass them along. Oh, we already have one. So was there some Unionist sentiment in Northern Virginia?
There was, yes. That's a great question. I think, and there's factions, I think, across the state of Virginia, I guess depending on where you're at. But yes, there were some Unionist sentiment in Northern Virginia. I'm sure that sentiment, altered a bit after the Federal Army occupied the landscape there. But yeah, I mean, there were Unionist sentiment in Southern Maryland as well, depending on who you were. If you talk to the federal soldiers, if these people were Unionists, they would tell you no. They said that everyone that was around them in many ways were likely secessionists, but were just not admitted. Or didn't admit that. Thanks, John. I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's a good one, actually. And another park you can visit to explore actually Northern Virginia's feelings during the outset of the Civil War is Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. They get into that divide between Western Virginia and Virginia.
Oh, and you know what? I wanted to mention another thing as well, Shannon, and I forgot to do. I apologize. Okay, so because I did answer that question about the first defenders. Here's a little bit more as well in regards to the troops that were in DC. We talked about the militia companies, which were sworn into federal service, by the way. As I said, there's a few regular Army cav units, artillery, and infantry, and that would be depleted with the resignation of a lot of officers. We talked about the first defenders being, second U.S. cav, but obviously the Pennsylvania militia groups. And here's an important thing as well that I forgot to mention. And let me look at my notes real quick, just quick patience here. Well, I've had this question asked for me quite often. What about African American troops? Well, we have an answer here. Well, there was a gentleman, a local DC native, I believe DC native, but he was well known in the city amongst African Americans, named Jacob Dotson. And he writes to the Secretary of War on April 23rd, 1861. And he says this to Simon Cameron: "Sir, I desire to inform you that I know of some 300 reliable colored free citizens of the city who desire to enter the service for the defense of the city." So that's kind of a really interesting message, right? 300 reliable free citizens. So there's a mix of free and enslaved people in Washington. And he says this: "I have been 3 times across the Rocky Mountains in the service of the country with Fremont, General John C. Fremont, and others. I can be found about the Senate chamber, as I have been employed about the premises for some years." That's right, I forgot about that. He worked in the building there. "Yours respectfully, Jacob Dotson." The reply from Simon Cameron comes 6 days later, Washington City: "Sir, in reply to your letter of the 23rd instant, I have to say that this department has no intention at present to call into service of the government any colored soldiers." So that's April 29, 1861. And as we know, there will be enlistment of Black soldiers in Washington moving forward, but that will take some time. The 1st Regiment United States Colored Troops are organized and recruited in DC on Mason's Island, Theodore Roosevelt Island, in 1863.
Yeah, and actually,
okay, so Brian, okay.
Sorry, Steve, you got another one here from Brian.
Yeah, I was thinking. Yeah, hi Brian, good to hear from you, my friend. I learned to think of DC as a border city during the war. How serious was the threat of a secession movement in DC itself? That's a great question, Brian. Oh wow. Yeah, I think there was a strong movement. Was there a serious threat? I don't think possible with just the number of troops that were in the capital at that time. As we know, I mean, they used force in, suspending the habeas corpus in Maryland to really keep Maryland at that point in the Union. So from Richard Houston's question, how real was the chance of Maryland seceding? I think it was pretty high. And so high enough for suspending of, the right habeas corpus and, breakup of the kind of the Maryland commissioners as well.
So yeah, we've got some good comments coming in about Washington. Now, yeah, Steve, as you point out, the situation in Maryland will be addressed by
definitely
the suspension of habeas corpus and of course the forts throughout Baltimore that we'll cover in the next few weeks.
I think Matthew makes a great point. He's another DC junkie, DC fort junkie, one of our regulars. Is DC became a destination for enslaved people. Absolutely, at least 40,000 enslaved people were coming into federal lines. As we know, as we've talked about, Matthew, on our tours across DC. And that's why I was so fascinated by that image of the 7th New York State Militia with those young African-American children, right? Where do they come from? That's something I hope that perhaps through more reading of accounts from the 7th New York, we can find out more information. But I believe a lot of them were camp servants and, officers, servants and things like that. Let's see. That John Weaver guy, of course. You mentioned that Fort Washington was too far south to be part of the defenses of Washington. Did you want to talk about the difference? Hold on, let me go. Oh yeah, that's a great question. Okay. So yeah, we talked, I showed you the map of the defenses of Washington. We talked about the sector they called an immediate threat was Northern Virginia, mostly the Arlington Heights. That's why the vast majority of the forts will be built there. built of earthworks. Basically, we saw the image at the end of Fort Sumter. Earth and wood, in many ways, will be the main construction material used for the defenses of Washington. But I guess we have to talk about the second transition system, as my friend John Weaver would say, the transition boards from Fort Washington, and then Fort Foote, built on the Potomac River in 1863 for river defense, which is interesting enough. And I guess that's a great thing to mention. We see with the evolution of the war is the threat along the river. You know, the Potomac River, the fear of the Confederate Navy rolling up ironclad gunships to shell the federal capital there. Heck, well, Fort Washington had been around for quite some time. The original fort was built, you know, before the War of 1812, and then imploded and then rebuilt after the War of 1812. And then you had Fort Foote itself with its massive 15-inch Rodman guns built to protect the capital along the river. And across in Alexandria, we talked about the occupation of Alexandria. There was 15-inch Rodmans at Battery Rogers as well, which would provide a pretty wicked crossfire of heavy artillery there. So as I mentioned, there's about 6 or so forts constructed right after federal occupation of Virginia. And I tend to call them kind of fort operating bases for the Army. The Army can occupy the high ground there to ensure that no one will shell the capital, but they're also able to move men and supplies across the river safely, kind of build up forces there, because the guy that commands Northern Virginia will be Irvin McDowell, and he commands the Army of Occupation, which becomes the Army of Northeastern Virginia. And that will be the army that fights at Manassas/Bull Run, right? And so, yeah, you have these forts, and then you can use these to spring off into this offensive or this campaign against Manassas. What is interesting about the original forts, I do want to share this. You know, July 21st, we had the first battle, you know, the first battle of Manassas or Bull Run, which obviously ends in a federal defeat. As the men are retreating towards the city, they are instructed by Winfield Scott, what the commanders are, to retreat to the protection of the fort's guns, which is really, really interesting, right? So even by July of 1861, the forts are already being put into service there, okay? So, see, could Confederate forces had opportunity to take Arlington Heights before the U.S. Army? David, I think it's possible, yes, that Confederate forces had the opportunity to take Arlington Heights before the U.S. Army was there to organize it. Absolutely, and the reason why I say that because they're so focused on organizing the defense of the main capital and the federal infrastructure. So you know all the stone structures in the in the city, the Capitol building, the Treasury building, and things like that. If you read what Charles Stone writes about this, they've got flour and bread in the basement of these buildings just in case, to endure, I think, about a 14-day siege until the regular army can arrive to basically rescue the city, right? Which is so interesting to think about. And David, I also think there's a reason why when they crossed the Potomac River on May 23rd, there's almost 20,000 men that did that crossing. They needed a lot of men to secure the ground there, and they were able to do that. Okay, so Josh says, why was there such a turnover of personnel at the forts? Didn't they require skilled cannoneers who knew the environment? Absolutely, and that's why they organized and recruited heavy artillery regiments. Really starting in late 1861, they started garrisoning the forts in 1862-ish, and were there until 1864. And these men were trained specifically on the siege guns. They did test firing throughout the weeks. And they were highly skilled at this, but heck, if you got 25,000 or 35,000 unused troops in Washington, if you're Ulysses S. Grant in 1864 and you're trying to duke it out with all these Confederate armies in the field, you need as much men as you can get. So that's why these men were taken from the defenses of Washington in 1864. About 25,000 heavies were taken out of DC. Ironically, during the Confederate raid on Washington under Jubal Early, the commanders in DC were calling for the heavies to come back to Washington because they needed someone to fire the guns, which is really, really interesting. But my friend John Weaver and I are actually presenting for Fort Monroe tomorrow. So if you're more interested in fortifications, Fort Monroe, heavy artillery, I'm actually talking about heavy artillery and the regiments and the Civil War. Please come out and check that out. I can share more information on our Facebook page as well. But I want to share this story with you real quickly about heavy artillery and the Civil War, which I'll share tomorrow. So the 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery was being recruited in late 1861. And the soldiers, the recruits were told that they would be armed with sabers and pistols and be sent to Washington, and they wouldn't have to do any marching, and they would be residing literally in the defenses of Washington around the forts, okay? The men were pretty happy about that. When they got to Virginia in 1864, according to the historian of the regiment, that's the first time they tried hardtack. Can you believe that? You know why? Well, because they got fresh baked bread in Washington every single day because there was ovens in the basement of the Capitol building, okay? So imagine going from fresh bread in DC to eating hardtack and fighting these armies in Virginia. That's quite the change there. So, okay, let's see here. I don't know if we have, Shannon, do we have time to answer these last couple of questions?
Well, we've still got a few minutes, so
Okay.
if you can, please do.
So that New Jersey regiment, yeah, actually, they were the New York militia guys, commanded by a major general of militia named General, I just lost his name, right? General Runyan. So they built Fort Runyan that was on the present ground location of the Pentagon. And actually, he was considered the reserve division and did not serve at Manassas, but he had a few thousand troops that were in Northern Virginia, just in case there was a defeat. And they will be really put into service to operate the forts just for a few weeks as the Army retreats towards Washington. Okay, was the Windsor... Matthew, I don't know the exact answer to that. I think so in regards to telegraph transmissions. I know friends that are people that are real experts of Civil War Washington and kind of what happens in the federal city. I'll tell you this, it does make sense because Matthew, when General Winfield Scott was recalled to Washington from New York, his office was at the Windsor building. So I believe that's where the War Department was wrong. I don't want to be quoted incorrectly on that, but that would make sense to me. Matthew, is that right? Was that where the Windsor building was at with the War Department? I believe so. Because Lincoln would actually walk there from the White House daily. So that would make sense. And I guess this concludes the program. I thank everyone for joining us.
Yeah, so thank you, Steve, for joining us. I really appreciate it. And for all of you who tuned in for this, like you said, Great History Lunch Hour. So that was our idea, is we hope you could sit back and enjoy your lunch and listen to some really good historians. Next week, if you're interested, and I hope that you are, the Maryland Center for History and Culture will be joining us. Alex Lothstein is going to share some of their collections and the stories associated with them. So we'll be looking at not only the Pratt Street riot and their collections items from it, but the development of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, in Maryland. And so we're narrowing in on Baltimore in 1861, looking at insurrection and consequences throughout this month as we look back 160 years ago to, obviously Steve's pointed out, a very critical moment for the Capitol, and we'll see how Baltimore plays into that, into securing the Capitol. So thank you guys. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope we'll see you throughout the rest of this month.